So yeah, I'm going to be talking a little bit about violence in video games and kind of some of the cultural kind of feelings around this and some of the history about how people have reacted to violence in video games and how it's been used for things like marketing and different things like that. And so, as I mentioned, there's a few points for discussion where I'm going to kind of ask you guys to think about these topics as game designers. We'll do that when those come up. Um, but yeah, we're mostly talking about sort of the history and the cultural conversation around depictions of violence and the use of violence as a mechanic in video games. So again, the obvious content warning discussions of violence. Um, so uh, Talking a little bit about the history first. When we think of violence in video games, obviously we're gonna have a lot of things are gonna come to mind. Typically around modern video games, things like Grand Theft Auto or Dark Souls that have high quality graphics depicting violent acts. That's something that we see in the media a lot. We see in the news a lot. That's a sort of controversial topic when it comes to discussing games. And so we're going to look a little bit about the history of that. This has been an aspect of video game culture and video game criticism, like literally since the beginning of video games. And we've kind of looked at a lot of like old video games and how they progress. Like we talked about sound last time, and we looked at sound with Pong versus sound with later games. And there's kind of a similar history when it comes to depictions of violence. This is kind of an interesting game. It's earlier than a lot of the other games that we've talked about. It's an arcade game. So it was like a physical arcade cabinet that was really popular in arcades. It came out in 1976. I'm just going to show a little clip from it. It's called Death Race, and you can see the graphics are extremely rudimentary. It's like Pong. It's just black and white pixels on a screen. There's like very little to the gameplay other than what you're seeing here. Is like basically you're just driving a car and you're trying to run people over. And that's pretty much the whole game. It's like Pong, except you're trying to, run people over in a car. And this game was actually really, really popular, and it was also very controversial. It was kind of like the first sort of like moral panic around video games. It's kind of interesting because if you think about this versus some of the other games that we've looked at, like Space Invaders, really the only difference here is that we're depicting people rather than like aliens or something like that. The level of abstraction is very similar. And the sort of like graphic content is, by our modern standards, pretty tame. And so it's funny to imagine people getting upset about it, but I think part of what makes games different that we've been talking about all semester is the quality of agency that is involved in playing a game. So it's not just watching a car run over people, which we could see in plenty of movies, but it's actually becoming the person who's driving the car that's running over people. So we're like embodying this violent act that I think makes this different than other experiences that even in the 70s certainly there were much more violent depictions of things on TV or in films. So there's a kind of a moral panic around Death Race, and there's a lot of criticism, and it sort of had this inverse effect of making the game much, much more popular. So all of this negative press about how violent and kind of disturbing this game was actually made the game much, much more popular and led to higher game sales. And then this kind of not necessarily created, but sort of is an example of, or kind of shows this tendency in video games and other media to actually court that type of controversy in order to increase sales, increase attention. So having something that's extremely controversial, it can even, it can be a good thing if what you're interested in is getting attention, getting more press. So this is a quote from an article about the history of this game from the Game Studies website that I think I've linked to before. It's an interesting article on this history. And the quote, public outrage not only fueled sales of the game that made Exidy a household name. Exidy is the company that developed the game, but established a pattern by which controversial games receive a high level of press attention, which in turn drive the game's marketplace success. So we've seen this, with a lot of modern games, like Grand Theft Auto is probably the one that comes to mind. So we're going to talk a little bit more about, how prevalent violence really is in video games. But before we do that, let's pause and have a little discussion on why do we think video games do include these depictions of violence. So, what is the game mechanic, or what is the sort of like advantage that using violence has when it comes to creating video games? So thinking about this from, the game designer's perspective, what do you guys think?
Because it's like a healthy release, like nobody's actually getting hurt, and so it's it's just like something that is a stress reliever for a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that's a good explanation or idea. It's a way that people can experience something in a safe environment that is, they can, experience something and relieve stress. That's a good thought. Other ideas?
It's like escapism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, kind of a similar idea. Well, I guess it's a little bit different. The idea of escapism, like being part of a different world and having again sort of this like safe space to experience those things.
Hmm.
Shock and horror and sex sell. Anything that is an extreme of something is going to get your attention. It's going to get your adrenaline up. Look at the cover of any newspaper, if there are any newspapers anymore. Stories of horrible, terrible things are more apt to get our attention than flowers and puppy dogs and happiness.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and certainly reflected in the theory by the Death Race developers that if we make something that's very sort of attention grabbing and controversial, it's going to drive sales and drive
You're
attention
not
to the
going to do
game.
Custard's Last Stand, are you?
Not no, I don't think so. I think
Oh,
I might have referenced it. Uh, I'm not sure actually. Maybe I've referenced it. I think I've talked about it before, but I can't remember if it's in here. We'll find out. It'll be a mystery.
right on.
Cool. Thank you. So let's keep going. There's a couple more points for discussion, but those are all really good thoughts. So thank you for contributing to those. So moving forward a little bit in terms of the video game history, in the 90s, there was formed the ESRB, which is the Entertainment Software Rating Board, which created ratings for games, sort of like, R-rated or PG-13 for the movies. And this is kind of similar to other rating systems that have come along for other types of media. Comic books had the Comics Code Authority in the 50s. Music had the Parental Advisory label, in the 90s as well. And the idea behind the rating system is to prevent kids, like underage people, from being able to purchase video games that had, graphic depictions of violence and sex. So this came out of sort of a cultural reaction to new video games with higher levels of graphics, like Mortal Kombat and Doom, which focused a lot on fighting and gore and gun violence. So that with Doom and with Mortal Kombat, if you guys have played the old versions of those games, again, by today's standards, they look pretty tame, but the content of what they were presenting was intentionally, hyper violent, kind of gory. That was kind of it was almost cartoonishly over the top in terms of violence that it was depicting. And that kind of, once there were kids playing these games, that kind of led to different groups that were, politically organizing to try to prevent those games from being sold to kids. Following the Columbine High School shooting in 1999, which we talked a little bit about when we were talking about indie games, the shooters in the Columbine High School shooting were known to have played violent video games like Doom. And so this created the first like really big sort of like news moral panic around video games. There's a lot of other cultural things involved in that. I don't know how much you guys would remember, but people were trying to ban video games and ban Marilyn Manson and all the different styles of music and all this other stuff that was popular at the time. And so that was the first time that this like really strong connection was made in the news and in reporting between the fact that these actually real life violent criminals had been playing violent video games. And this led to just an insane sort of number of different studies commissioned by different advocacy groups and the government and different researchers trying to figure out if there was a sort of causal relationship between playing violent video games and actually committing violent acts. Most of those studies, there's still, I don't know that you can say that anything is 100% conclusive, but there really haven't been studies that have shown that playing violent video games correlates or has a causal relationship with future, violent actions, while other social factors are shown to relate to that. And then this is a chart that I think will, kind of hammer home that idea. If you're sort of, unconvinced about that. And so this chart, this is from a study from 2015, and it shows countries where video game playing is popular. And in the left side, it shows sales per capita. So it's a rough measure of how popular video games, how much money does the individual person spend on video games. And you can see, the US is not super high on the list. We're actually pretty low compared to South Korea, which is pretty high, or the Netherlands, which is very high. And then on the right side, the gun homicides per capita. So actual real world violence. And you can see in pretty much every country, this number is below 1. And in a lot of countries, it's below 0.1. And in the US, it's almost 3 gun homicides per capita. So, you can kind of draw the obvious conclusions from that at least as it comes to that relationship in the US, it seems like it seems like there isn't like a direct relationship between the popularity of video games and gun violence. Obviously, there's a lot of other factors that could play into this, but that's just one sort of example. So moving forward a little bit, in 2005, following new, even more hyper-realistic video games with violent depictions of violence like Grand Theft Auto, an actual law was passed in California that banned the sale of video games to people under the age of 18 and created a new rating system independent of the ESRB to define violent video games. So that's because the ESRB didn't actually have, it was just kind of a rating system. It didn't have like any legal standing, like, it didn't actually prevent people from being able to buy things. So there was a law that was passed that did actually prevent, underage people from buying violent video games with a different rating system. Later, that law was struck down in 2011, ruling that video games were protected under the First Amendment. And so kind of like since then, we really haven't had a lot of more efforts to kind of put rating systems or put laws around who can buy different types of video games. Okay, so pause again for discussion, and then we'll talk a little bit more about some more research on this. So just a sort of pretty general, broad question about whether video games are more violent than other media, like film or comics or novels or anything else that you might read or watch or something like that. So, what do you guys think about this? Or do video games tend to have more violence, or do you think it's pretty even across different media?
I mean, me personally, I could say that, like, I don't know about novels that much because I guess, the violence could just be like, just you have to think of like, think how the violence is going to look like. So it has to be described in like vivid words.
Hmm.
I say comics, well, depending on like, which year the comic era came out, or which, like, well, yeah, of course, yeah, which era the comic is. Can, like, some of them might have like over the top deaths and things like that, while some of them are just like, mundane. I don't know if I could like I don't know if I should like put manga and comics in like the same category of like, picture books with pictures and a storyline happening. But then if I were to like combine like these graphic novels together, I guess, they could have like some sort of like violence in them, but that's
Hmm.
depending on the genre that the comic is going for. So I wouldn't say, like, I wouldn't generally put all comics or practically all these type of genres into the category of like being violent, or anyway, kind of like comparing to video games.
Okay, so to
But
kind
then
of,
video but huh?
sorry, go ahead.
But then for video game wise, just like how you showed the statistics of like video games compared to actual crime, like shooting out there, since South Korea right there is like, you know, most to buy video games or invest in the video games, yet have the lowest crimes, throws out the whole argument of like video games being cause of violence and things like that.
Hmm.
I mean, I don't think I don't think video games necessarily cause violence. I think some of an already violent person could be encouraged through them, but um, I also don't think that those statistics prove the argument that they're trying to. Because I just don't think the causation and correlation are the same. Because the U.S. it's easier to access a gun. It's easier to commit a violent crime in the U.S. than other places.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I agree with that. Like the whole factor of like us getting the actual weapon to do the crime compared to like being influenced by something is more like on the side of actually having the acquirements of like getting the weapon. Because I agree with that also.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there isn't like it's not a like fully conclusive argument. There's a lot of different factors for sure.
Hmm.
Um, but let's bring it back just for a second to this question of whether video games generally are more violent than other media. Anybody else have thoughts on that?
Actually, I do think that video games are more violent than other kind of like film and comics. For example, if you play a video game, you have to do the action. So sometimes you are not just try to observe something. You have to do the action, try to chop somebody's head. That's totally a different level than just observing. So that's why I feel like that's why I think maybe video games are more violent.
Okay, yeah, I think that's a good point. Bringing it back to the idea of agency, um, you know, watching something passively versus actually taking action to do something may change the experience of that violent action or depiction. I think in video games we also have the option, sometimes, not always, but we also have the option not to act violently if we don't want to. So that may play into that as well. All right, let's continue. Thanks again. We have another discussion thing that we'll come back to in a second. So we'll talk a little bit more about some different studies. So as I mentioned, lots of research has gone into the study of this relationship between violence in video games and violent acts in real life. And there are people who kind of advocate both sides of that argument. There's been studies from lots of different perspectives. There have been studies that show a link between video game play and higher levels of aggression, depression, and anxiety. Other studies have been inconclusive. Studies have not been able to show a significant relationship between video game play and real-world violence or violent crime. 97% of children play video games, and it is estimated that over half of games depict some form of violence. So, it's going to be hard to kind of like pick apart that level of ubiquity when it comes to people who play games. Federal crime statistics suggest that serious violent crimes among youths have decreased since 1996, even as video game sales have soared. So again, not a conclusive argument, but another way of looking at it is that over this like same time period, I think there's a chart in here somewhere. Oh yeah, I think this shows, oh no, this is the 97% of teens who play video games. I guess this doesn't have the chart I was looking for, but just the basic idea that over this period of time, violent crime has gone down consistently since 1996, while obviously video game sales have gone up and up and up. Another study showed that people are more likely to blame violent video games as a cause of school shootings by white perpetrators rather than African-American perpetrators, possibly because of racial stereotypes that associate minorities with violent crime, according to new research published by the American Psychological Association. So I think that's another thing to consider is people's own bias. I think, especially when it comes to this sort of moral panics and news that tend to come up around these type of violent events. Typically, when video games are involved, it's because there's a white shooter, and it kind of plays into people's sort of biases about what types of people kind of do different things. So that shows another form of bias that comes into these stories. So talking more about the role of violence in video games, why is violence so often depicted in video games? Some studies of violence in film and video games have suggested that the experience can actually alleviate anxiety because it has been suggested viewers are able to experience extreme emotions in a safe environment. So it's kind of similar to the point that Sonora was making earlier. This idea of experiencing something in a safe environment that can sort of be a release or a way to relieve anxiety. While many video games depict graphic violence, the most popular video games in terms of sales include games like Minecraft, Tetris, and Mario Kart. So if you look at like the most popular games out there, most of them are not actually violent video games. Kind of going back to this history of depicting violence in Death Race. This is a quote from the owners or people who ran Atari that published the game. We were really unhappy with that game Death Race. Atari had an internal rule that we wouldn't allow violence against people. You could blow up a tank or you could blow up a flying saucer, but you couldn't blow up people. We felt that that was not good form, and we adhered to that all during my tenure. And so again, kind of, with Space Invaders, with these other games that have virtually the same mechanics, those aren't necessarily considered crossing this line of depicting violence against people. So thinking a little bit about morality in video games, can video games actually increase our ability to make moral decisions? In previous classes, we've looked at examples of games that have political or moral themes, and researchers have also looked into how video games can model moral and ethical behavior and decision-making. A book actually by a CUNY professor at Baruch called Warplay explores the relationship between the US military and video game developers. The military has funded games for recruitment, training, and treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. And so our last discussion before we have some links, as game designers, again, thinking from the perspective of people who are creating a game, should we use violence in our games or not? What are the pros and cons of using depictions of violence? And so I want to think about this not from a judgmental perspective, but just from a sort of designer perspective of, a lot of, video games use violence. A lot of video games don't use violence. If I'm designing a video game, should I use violence? Should I avoid violence? Does it really matter which direction I go? What do you guys think when you've thought about, creating your games? What have you thought about when it turns to, adding in violence or fighting or different actions? What do you guys think about that?
I
Or
think you.
like for like
Oh,
our games, like the ones we're creating.
Yeah, thinking about your own game, have you thought about, when you're thinking about what is my character doing and what obstacles should I put in and what rewards should I put in, have you been thinking about whether you want it to be violent or whether you want it to avoid violence, or is it something that you're just not thinking about? You're just thinking about whatever you think makes sense?
Well, there's I guess for like simple.
Jordan, you're cutting out a little bit. I'm not sure if you have a...
Am I?
Yeah, I don't know if you have a bad connection or... let's come back to you in a second. Paris, did you have a thought?
yeah, I was gonna say that I kind of, I guess when I was making my game, it was just I was kind of already thinking of certain ideas of like how to fight and stuff like that. But I think in general, I think like conflict in a story is kind of necessary to create like a interesting dynamic with the character, with like the player. So I mean, there's games that don't have fighting or violence, but they kind of like for an action game, if you want to have a certain level of interactiveness and like and what do you call it? I guess adrenaline and stuff like that for for the player, like you want to have games that push that boundary of violence to try and get the player to feel more engrossed in like the mechanics of the game. Like I guess for me, I'd say like something like Devil May Cry. You're not fighting people, you're mostly fighting like demons and monsters and weird creatures and stuff like that. But like the mechanics of the game kind of push you to like really master the fighting and the action of the game. So it kind of rewards you for the violence in a way. But I mean, I guess for in the design perspective, like you can't really have an action game without some violence, if that makes sense. So it's like, huh. I guess I'm kind of talking in circles, I feel, but I just feel like it's hard. It's almost impossible to try and make certain genres of games without having violence, and it's kind of like how much of your artistic vision should be hindered by like societal, like you know, beliefs and stuff like that. Like artists always, when even in like painting and stuff like that, artists would depict stuff that would push the boundaries of like what's okay in their society and stuff like that, like to try and make a point or just try and like get a reaction out of the viewers or like emotion. So I think that violence is kind of a good way of creating strong emotion.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting perspective, and I do think it's really also wrapped up in genre. Like we talked a little bit earlier in the semester about different genre conventions and how they create these different expectations. And so even a game as simple as Mario, you wouldn't think of Mario as a violent game, but it does involve jumping on top of other creatures and kind of killing them. And so there's not like blood spurting everywhere and stuff like that, but it still represents this kind of act of violence. And it is true that it's part of the genre. So when we start to think about creating that style of game, it's kind of baked in there that we're going to think about like, oh, okay, well, if there's an enemy running at me and I jump up, I can kill them by landing on them or shooting a laser at them or whatever it is. That's kind of part of the genre conventions that we're used to. And I do think another thing that you were sort of touching on is how people are going to react to it. So that's another thing that we don't always think about. And you don't necessarily have to if you're just creating a game for fun and you just want to create your vision of what a game should be. But if you're making a game for, that you want to put online for people to play, or if you're working for a studio or something like that, that's something if you think about is who's the audience for this game. And sometimes games that are hyper violent are made that way specifically to reach an audience. Or some games might avoid violence if they want to reach a different audience that is not going to engage with that. So I think those are some questions to be considering as game designers. Cool. Jordan, are
Yes,
you?
actually, I feel like it's a philosophy question. It just
Mhm.
depends on how you recognize yourself. As long as you think you are a human being, so if the character is a human being, then you think the violence is violence. But, for example, if the character is an animal and you are a vegan, then when you kill the animal, you still feel painful. So it just depends on who you are and how you consider about the how you define the violence.
Yeah, I think that's a good point actually. It's kind of funny actually. I had a student a few years ago who made a game. She was a vegan and she made a game where she was like stabbing like vegetables and stuff. It was a pretty good one. But yeah, I think that's a really good point. That it kind of depends on the context. It depends on the point of view. What we consider violent actions. Cool. Thank you guys. Any other thoughts before we continue?
Something you said kind of made me think more about something too. You said like Mario, in Mario, it doesn't really show excessive violence, but in the end, you're killing like a bunch of Goombas, you're killing a bunch of Koopas, you're like genociding all these creatures. But in like it's a game that has like a E for everyone rating or whatever like that. So it seems like there's a bit of a what would you call it? Like a not a double standard, but it's kind of like as long as it ignores a lot of the actual concepts of like death and like killing when it comes to the sort of I guess stigma of violence in video games. Because if that's the case of like you're not seeing the killing, so it's a game where you just like push a button and blow up a country less violent than a game where you're like maybe just violently like killing like one person in the game. Like if like it's like a 10-second or 20-second game where you're fighting one person and there's a bunch of blood and a bunch of guts or whatever, but you're just killing this one person because like it's I know, I guess I'm not really saying anything too direct, but yeah.
I think in sorry, I lost my train of thought. In those instances, it's not necessarily an argument against conflict. It's against the violence and the gore. Like, Mortal Kombat was on the original Nintendo. It just didn't have blood, whereas on the Sega system there was blood. And so I also like see what you're saying. Like, it's kind of like a weird hypocritical double standard of just like what makes one person comfortable over the other. I think Mario is an example of a game that actually caters to different people's motivations, because some people could be motivated through like the big defeat of the final boss and like just slaughtering enemies, or other people could say, oh, I'm just trying to get through the speed run, I'm trying to collect as many coins as possible. And so that's an example of a way you could be motivated through Mario that has nothing to do with violence.
Mhm. But there's something that you brought up that sorry, you can talk.
Oh, in my opinion, everything needs a good hook. And as you were just saying, with Mario, you got a couple of different motives. You can go looking for Easter eggs. You can go to gather points. You can go to like save the princess. What the violence comes down to, nothing good is created without some kind of tension. To use the cliche, diamonds come from constant pressure, pearls come from constant irritation. You have two phases, you either have static or dynamic. Either something's in motion like the fire or something's still like the wood. and how it is articulated to us through the video game is kind of contingent upon the developer. Mario had a lot of great hooks. What's going to be the hook for your video game? That's up to you. But violence is sometimes a hook for people. It draws people in, especially like the violence in Tetris is the violence against time, the pressure time puts on you, and seeing the bricks build up. The violence in, let's say, my favorite Fallout 76 is avoiding nuclear destruction. Uh, but it is all the same thing. It's either static or dynamic. Am I making sense or am I ranting?
You're making a lot of sense. I think you're bringing up like really good points that it's just like it's kind of part of the nature of getting something done. And I think it's funny that you brought up Tetris, because Tetris is something that you wouldn't think of having violence, but has actually arguably driven people to also do violent things. Like almost all the creators of Tetris ended up killing somebody.
Yeah, it's there's always going to be tension. There's always going to be that pressure, but that's what kind of like stimulates. I think the part of the brain is called the amygdala, for happiness, and just kind of get that dopamine flowing because you came through a challenge. Some people need that visual stimulation of violence to get there. Other people, Mario jumping and collecting coins is fantastic. Insofar as violence level of video games these days, it's my big fear with my son's 8 years old. It's not game itself; it's the idiots he interacts with online. The interaction with all random sorts. He kicks my butt at Fortnite on a regular basis. But some of the stuff that comes out of these people's mouths, it's just like, okay, I know it's smack talk, but he's 8, I'm 40 something. So that's where my concern as a parent comes from. You can make an argument that does cause a lot of cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is, it's just getting so engaged in a certain role that you would not pay attention to, someone lighting fire to a hobo. Extreme example, but you're so engaged in your process and your daily, rhythm of the video game, and then that which you personify on your life. Oh well, that's not my skill set. I can't go put the hobo out. So yeah, I talked about hobos being on fire. I apologize to anyone who knows a hobo. I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say that anymore. Can we still say hobo?
I'm not sure, but I appreciate. I think that's an interesting perspective too. We didn't really talk about like the social aspect of gaming, which is like a whole other component to this of how people interact with each other, especially in online spaces, in in spaces where you're kind of anonymous or detached from your physical self and your identity and stuff like that. So that's a whole other kind of topic to talk about. But I think it's a really interesting thing to bring up. And yeah, I didn't know that thing about the Tetris creators. I'm gonna have to do some more research into that. But it makes sense. Tetris is definitely the thing that makes me like miss my stop on the train more than anything else. But anyway, I think we can kind of move on to the next part. But thank you guys for all contributing to this discussion. Obviously, there's we could talk about these issues for a long time, and we can continue to kind of discuss them in the semester, in the chat or in different ways. I'll just real quick show some of the links for some of the sources for this if you guys are interested in kind of doing some more reading or in some cases watching some videos and stuff. This is one of the studies. I think I already showed this a little bit, that I got some of the data that I cited from. This is another study that I also kind of cited and has this chart that I was showing. This is another study, kind of looking at the same stuff that kind of has some interesting data points. Let's see. Yeah, another one of these studies. They're all kind of similar, kind of looking at the same concepts from slightly different angles. This is that Game Studies article that kind of has a really interesting history of some different games and violence in video games in general. It's a good one to check out. Another study that I cited, kind of talking about bias in these stories. And then, oh, this one is I thought I had a YouTube video in here somewhere, but I guess maybe that was somewhere else. This is not loading. Here we go. This is a interview with the author that I mentioned, who's a professor at Baruch, about his game or his book, talking about the military in video games, which is a really interesting book. So yeah, those are some of the references. There's a lot more stuff out there, obviously, but if you guys are interested in checking out those sources, they are there. So cool. Thank you guys for offering your thoughts. And let me stop the recording.